Welcome to Creating Better Products, where we explore the real world stories from product leaders. Not just their successes, but also their failures and their lessons learned. You will get practical tips that you can apply tomorrow. And today we will speak about using data for decision making in our products. What does it mean to be data led versus data informed? How can we go beyond data itself and have the confidence to use other data like qualitative and small data? How can we have the confidence to trust our intuition and try something new beyond the data that's in front of us? And to discuss this really interesting topic, I have a wonderful guest today. That is Beks Yelland. Beks, you are a product leader with over 20 years of experience in startups, scale-ups, and corporate companies. So really broad spectrum. And you've worked in many industries from finance, media, and climate tech. And you are also the founder of an organization called the Female Product Lead that aims for equity in product leadership. So it's a really interesting background. Beks, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Sabrina. I'm really happy to be here.
Wonderful. Is there anything you'd love to add for our listeners around your background and story of how you've grown into that product leader of over 20 years?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I tend to break my 25 odd years up into sort of three big chunks. So like you said, I started off in sort of gaming and betting, ended up doing a large stint at Sky, and then moved into news for a little bit. And then I did about 10 years in finance, so big corporates, all the way through to small fintech startups. So I've worked in massive organizations, very small organizations. And then the last several years have been in sort of tech for good, so climate tech and health tech. And I'm currently consulting in the climate tech and health tech space. I'm really enjoying that. And I think the one thing that I would say that I've learned over that broad spectrum of experiences and industries is the role of product and the role of product leadership is always very, very similar. The challenges can be very, very similar. It's just how you deal with them can be different. And I'm really excited to talk to you about data and finding data and helping data, but data helping us sort of know what the right thing to do is, and also share my observations on how that's changed over the last couple of decades as well.
Yeah, I'm really curious. What got you so passionate about this topic and what's your expertise in that area?
Well, it started, and I'll share this with your listeners as well, when I was putting like a little infographic together, just sort of trying to explain how the role of product had evolved, sort of since the early noughties all the way through to today, because there's been quite a lot of noise and discussion in the industry in recent times around the role being replaced by AI, or, as I refer to it, sort of Chesky Gate, where Brian Chesky, who's the founder and owner of Airbnb, made this bold statement around management and product marketing, and he'd evolved his roles, very much a design-led organization. And I was creating an infographic as a reaction to that, just to say to people, look, we've been here before. Back in the early noughties, we were writing really long Word documents, and the role of product management wasn't based in Agile as much as it is today. The software, in the software space, I should say as well, very, very much different in other industries. And literally, Agile landed on our shores, and the role just changed. I instead of sending over a document and 6 months later getting some feedback from the software team that I didn't spend any time with, I was literally walking across campus at Sky, spending every morning with post-it notes on the wall, having discussions and conversations with the developers. So the role massively changed overnight there, huge evolution very, very quickly. And then the other sort of interwoven change that I noticed as I was putting this sort of timeline together was the role of data in our discipline. So before big data, as if like data suddenly arrived, but it was like that almost. I remember when sort of big data became a thing, I was at HSBC running around the Bluefin building trying to find the data team that I'd heard rumours existed. Like, where are they and how do I use them? But before big data and before data lakes became a thing, and our ability to analyse the data of our products and our customers became a thing, we did two things, and not always both of them. We would tend to do, sort of qualitative research, so maybe focus groups, all around like really understanding the pain points of customers, spending time with customers, and really getting to know our customers well. And then if we had the time and the money, we would then do quantitative research off the back of that, where we would try and get some statistically valid information or data out of that. So we'd send surveys out to thousands of customers. If you had that many customers, and you would start to understand the things that you could do. So yes, there was some data there, but it was curated from a particular path or for a particular purpose or reason. It wasn't just we've got data about our customers and we've got data about the trajectory of usage of our customers and the customer flow that we can just tap into and look up. And so that was a massive evolution, a real change in how our role worked and what we did, and the role of product with data changed as well. And I sometimes think it was great, and sometimes I think it was bad. And the reasons I think it was bad is because of the fact that we became very reliant on data. And I think certainly when I've worked in B2C organizations where data is everything, like beyond the nth degree, certainly I think we can sometimes lose our voice as product people. We can sometimes find that we've lost our ability to make big, bold decisions, that we've lost our mojo maybe as a product people, and we rely on data so much that we almost don't have the guts or the gumption to just step out of our comfort zone and say, yes, I think this is what we should do. Like, I'm the voice of the customer in product. Sometimes, I've been in organizations where that would be your role. Like, people would say, right, come on, product, you're the voice of the customer to tell us what to do. And that doesn't always exist as much anymore.
So why is this a problem? Why do we need to have the mojo to try something beyond the data and maybe sometimes go opposite to what the data is telling us?
I mean, it's a really, really tricky one. And I think the best way to answer that is as like a real life example. Because if I talk hypothetically, I don't think it's really going to land. And I love telling stories. So I'll tell you a story. So I was at World Remit back in 2021, around that sort of time. And one of the things that I was responsible for, so my role was growth, like the growth of the product, which meant, from acquisition all the way through to retention. So the full scope of the customer journey. And there was this sort of almost laughable balance constantly happening. Like, we're upping acquisition because we've got an offer on. So you see an uplift in acquisition, and the company would flip and go, oh, no, now we need to fix retention because that's falling off a cliff because everyone's used the offer period and the retention's hugely is impacted by that because they stay for as long as the offer and then they go and find the next offer. And if you just went on the data there, we go, well, you need to fix acquisition in order to keep people coming in, and then you need to fix retention. And then it's just all about the data, and you're not thinking about what's the actual customer experience, what's happening in between those two fairly significant points that were very important data points for the business. And so we were lucky enough to have an incredible customer research team at World Remit that I was responsible for. And they'd done this amazing sort of like customer journey map that we could use. We didn't have to start from scratch, but we also were able to talk to customers because we knew the right questions to ask them. And so along with data, like actual hard data, and a little bit of customer insight, what we were able to learn was that customers who came in, there was an emotion attached to that transaction. And we're trying to understand, like, how's that emotion actually get in the way and cause issues with retention. And we found that 70% of our customers, or thereabouts, were actually sending the same money in the same way to the same person every time. And that was the reason that they used the service. So World Remit, sorry, I should have said, was a sort of cross-border payments, like Wise or Western Union, that type of thing. if any of your listeners are not familiar with the brand. And so we thought, well, actually, we need to make that journey for 70% of our customers much more seamless. And there's ways that you can do that, because if I'm sending, $10 to Sabrina to her current account every week, in your preferred German bank account, why would you ask me every time to like enter in that same information? I just want to send again. Do you want to send $10 to Sabrina again? Yeah, I do. Boom, done. And so removing that friction and removing the worry and the concern and taking some of that emotion out of that journey meant that, and making it more transactional, more functional, and more reliable, meant that we were increasing our trust in our customers, tick, that we were removing friction, tick, and lo and behold, we saw if we put offers in and fix some of that journey, obviously there's loads of other bits of the journey to fix as well, but that was a really big fix that we did. It meant that we didn't see our customers falling off a cliff in retention just because we brought them in, on the offer, because then it was sticky because it was easy. And that's always a thing, isn't it, in product? Like, where's the stickiness? How do you keep people engaged? How do you remove the friction? And so for me, I think that blend of data, yes, we need to make the data work for us. We need to bring people in, finding the data in terms of 70% of customers, but also that the trust and the emotion that was needed behind it. That was the blend that helped us find the magic sauce that actually fixed the problem, that saw the outcome which the business needed, which was you were fixing both ends of that journey.
Yeah, this is a great example of going beyond the data that we're tracking in the product that is so easily available, and then supplement that, I would say, with other data. That is the qualitative data that you mentioned. When we go and speak to customers and understand their motivation, their emotions, we cannot track that today automatically. We might be able to do that with a, customer satisfaction feedback survey, but that still doesn't get at the real stories that drive some of the decision making that leads customers to stay with a brand or leave. So I think it's a great example on that area.
I think the other one as well, that's quite useful, because it's a slightly different story. And when I was at Reuters years ago, I had the responsibility of the mobile platform. And at the time, the mobile platform, or the mobile app, was seen as like the companion app to the big desktop. So this is, think Bloomberg Terminal, banks and monitors, traders, investors, on the trading floor of a bank, monitor off. They've got like huge number of monitors on their screen, huge amounts of data that they're consuming, allegedly, all at once. And we had this mobile app, which at the time, the form size of mobiles was probably a lot smaller than it is today, but it was also iPhone, Windows, BlackBerry, and Android. And so we had this job, sort of tricky job to do. Like, how do we increase our customer engagement or usage on the mobile app to prove that the mobile app has a place in this environment? And so we did some research, and we sat down, and we actually, what you call ethnographic research. We sat down with our customers for, a couple of months, really starting to understand the need behind that, so that we could actually figure out how to increase our usage. And that was the data point that was going to keep the mobile app alive. Otherwise it was just going to get, cold probably over years. And we found that the customers, when they stepped away from their desk, they didn't need to be able to manage all of those things at once. They didn't need to be able to see all of that data that they had on all of those banks of monitors squeezed into that itty bitty tiny, screen on their mobile. Because the thing that they were doing when they were away from their desk was having a pint of beer, smoking a cigarette, playing a game of golf. And so what they were doing when they picked up the phone in those moments was a very different job. They just wanted to check that everything was okay, that they didn't have to run back to their desk, that they could carry on smoking their cigarette, drinking their pint, or playing the game of golf. Is everything okay? And the quickest way that they could do that, the most seamless way they could do that, was if you created, and this is what we ended up doing, a customizable dashboard that meant that they could, at any point in the day, find the information, the data point, the ticker that they needed to find to know that everything was fine. And we saw an uptick after we relaunched the platform, with that customizable dashboard, of 20x within a couple of months. Massive. But at the time, the data was telling a different story. The data was saying that customers don't need the mobile app. That was the data. And so if we hadn't gone to actually find the customer need, that data point would have made a very different decision and had a very different outcome.
What both of the stories show is how important it is to understand the context of use and what people are actually trying to achieve. In your first story, it was the emotion that it created and maybe the anxiety around that. And your second story, very much around, yes, if I'm out and about playing golf or having a pint of beer, the need on the application is very different than if I'm sitting at my desk.
Exactly.
And this is something that we can't automatically track in the app. We see the behavior, but we don't know the why.
Yeah.
And understanding the context and the emotion and the motivation and the job to be done that you mentioned, that then helps us actually make the right decisions for how to modify the application.
Yeah.
So I'm totally sold on this. You're totally sold on this. Why are we talking about it? What challenges do you see in companies really adopting this approach? Are they doing it? And if not, what's holding them back?
I think so. In terms of adopting this approach, what you're asking me is like sort of just being a data led to the expense of anything else. Yeah, and I think this is what I was talking about, going back to my point around the evolution of the role and how the role of product has become very data led, like data driving decisions. That's how we do it. Find the data will tell the story, use the data to make decisions, to prioritize what you're going to do, when you're going to do it, how you're going to do it. And I think what happens if companies focus just on that and don't understand that the intent, the emotion, the customer voice interwoven in the data is that you miss out on doing the right thing for one. But I think the other thing as well is that you're also removing the trust and the faith in the product team as an entity, as a people. And one of the other things that I've observed is that if you haven't created in the team a culture of psychological safety, that ends up that the team relies solely on the data because they don't feel empowered or emboldened to go with their gut instincts. They're only relying on the data. And even if they spend time with customers and they've got the depth of understanding and the emotion behind it, and they understand the need and the desires that are interwoven within the data, if they don't feel like they're in an environment where they are protected or they're not going to be vilified if they make a mistake, this is where I think we sometimes go wrong in the industry. I think you then find that there's a fear of failing, a fear of making the wrong decisions, and if you can't rely on the data in order to make a decision, then that's where the fear sort of creeps in. And so I would urge any product leader listening, or any sort of IC product person, that's the important thing that you need to get, that blend with the data and with the understanding of your customer, like to be able to step out of your comfort zone and be able to say, big bets, this is my gut, let's go here, and make those decisions, more informed decisions. You need to have a leadership that are going to support you in that sometimes.
So for me, that seems like a really risky approach, that I have one type of data that's very focused on the product itself and doesn't actually look left or right of what's happening. Why do organizations or product teams end up so focused on that? There is other data that can help us inform our decisions. And we can also quantify it if we need to. It's just we are gathering it not automatically in our tools, but we need to go out and speak to people. It's different data. And I think what I sometimes hear, it's, oh, but it's subjective. If you go and speak to people, it's subjective data, and it's not valued as much as quantitative stuff that's happening in the tool. Is that something you see, or what's preventing organizations from really looking much broader in the different types of data that they collect around customers to make a more holistic decision?
It absolutely depends. It could be anything, Sabrina. It could be the cost of taking the time to really think it through. It could be an inability to be able to do that. I think because the thing is as well with data is that it's massive sometimes. And so you've got reams and reams and reams of data. being churned in by thousands or millions of customer journeys and customer sort of points along the way. And if you haven't got a data team that are empowered or set up for success in order to be able to spend the time to understand that data, or if you haven't got a platform that's been set up properly, like anything like Tableau, Power BI, or whatever it might be, that, data can tell any story you want it to. But if you haven't got the right framework, the right structure, or the right people to be able to understand what the data could tell you, you can pick up any data point and make any assumption from that data point and then make a decision based on that assumption. And so I think there's often the stumbling blocks that people are going to find are going to be if they're ill-informed or ill-equipped to be able to spend the time adequately to understand what it is that the data could be telling them. And they also rush to make assumptions, and they then try to make the data validate those assumptions. And I'm not saying I've never done that, because obviously, that's an absolute 101 product error to make. Like, I know what I need to hear, and I need the data to sort of validate that. But I think the other thing is that you need the right team. You need the right customer insight team, the customer research team, to be set up to be able to challenge the product team. If you don't have that, so that it's all about that collaboration between your data analytics, your customer insights team, or your research team, and the product team. And if you've got this wonderful blend, I've had that a couple of times in my career, where you've got all of those people working for the same outcome, for the same reason, working collaboratively together, you're going to get to a much better outcome. And the example I gave at World Remit was where we were lucky enough to have all of those different disciplines working together in harmony.
Yeah. So it's having those disciplines, having them set up well, and then having them collaborate.
Yeah. And of course, if you don't have all of those, but you understand the need for that approach, then of course you can double or triple hat as a product person, because there's enough tools at your disposal now that you can probably figure it out for yourself. You don't need to be able to even write SQL now to run a query. You just, pump something into ChatGPT or any sort of AI, and you can find yourself, running your own queries if you want to. So obviously the world's changing at a massive pace in that way. So I'm certainly not saying that you need to have hundreds of people in order to be able to do your job properly. But all I'm trying to say is that blend of approaches, which could be covered by one or two people, is the way that you get that wonderful outcome, where you're thinking about things holistically from a data point of view and from a customer journey point of view, which is obviously all about the emotion. These are human beings we're talking about.
Yes. And then that probably will need that psychological safety for product leaders to say, actually, we're going to slow down. We're not going to rush to decision based on some data that we're seeing, but we're going to take that time to investigate what is actually happening here.
Yeah. Really diving into it and understanding what the emotion is that's driving it, rather than rushing to assumptions and missing the depth of the problem as well. I think that's something that happens a lot, for sure.
Yeah. And then you mentioned earlier the lack or the challenge of a lack of psychological safety, and how that prevents people from taking that broader view and relying very much on.
Well, it's a safety net, isn't it, Sabrina? If you've got the data and you can use the data, and then if the data's wrong, it's not your fault, because it's the data. Not that the data's wrong, but you've used the data in the wrong way. And I think that's part of the problem, is that we sort of, going back to that infographic that I created, and that customer and that sort of the product disciplinary evolution over the last couple of decades, I certainly, at that sort of point around like the mid-teens, when it started to become massively interwoven into our day-to-day roles, I saw a change in how product was working, and we weren't being asked to sort of come in and step up and be the big voice in the room and using our gut instincts anymore. And you couldn't just say, I really believe this is the right thing to do. And you could tell a good story. And if you had a good enough story behind it, or your pitch was good enough, you'd convince your colleagues that this was the right thing to do, because suddenly we're like, well, where's the data? Prove it. And I think that change in the role that I observed, it might have been different for other people, was where things started to change. And I think that's where fast forward, 5, 6, 7 years, that's when this whole thing around psychological safety also started to be talked about, because suddenly we're in a situation where, we're always front and center in our role. People are looking to us for the answer. And if you've got sort of people who've only come into the role in that period of time where data's been driving decisions, you've got a whole generation of product people who've only ever known that. And you then suddenly say to them, right, I want you to step outside of this sort of data led only approach. And I want you to add some depth and breadth and a bit of meat to the bones of that data and really bring the customer needs and the emotions into this a bit more. Yes, they can do that, but are they going to be bold enough to be able to tell the right story, or to make the pitch, or to step out of their comfort zone and place some big bets or make some recommendations? And if they are, great, because then you've got the perfect storm of ideation, gut instincts, data-led decision making all together. But if they're in an environment where they're not being set up for success, and if they make the wrong call, make the wrong decision, then they're being set up, for there's some finger pointing going on, then they're not going to do it again. They're going to feel scared. So I think it's really important as leaders that we're saying to our teams, it's okay if you make a mistake. We've got you. Let's learn together. You put people on a platform when they've been successful, but you put your arms around them and you learn together and you fix forward for the future.
Yeah, I love that term, fix forward. You've mentioned it before. I'm really curious. Can you dive a little bit deeper? What does fix forward mean for you?
Well, rather than sitting there doing a massive retrospective and all the things did wrong, or the decisions you made wrong, then think about how you can fix forward for the future. That's what I mean when I use that phrase. Like, what is it you need to do in order to be able to be better in the future, make better decisions in the future, learn from those mistakes, not dwell on them necessarily and feel like your team are being reprimanded, but let's all of us gather together and figure out what have we learned from that, as opposed, like, the thing is as well, if you don't make mistakes, then you're not going to learn, and you can't win if you don't. I mean, to be honest with you, you can't win if you don't even try, and if you don't try, you'll never fail, but then you're never going to win either. So you just need to keep moving forward as well.
Yes. And I think the fix forward is really inspirational and motivational, and like, this is how we move forward. This is how we get better as a team, or how I get better as a person. That's much more interesting than saying, don't do that.
Yeah.
Because what to do instead. And then also one feels bad about it. But like, what is the change in behavior to drive different outcomes in the future? So
I mean,
think
I
that's
can't think of any off the top of my head, but I'm sure your listeners would know there's so many examples of where, some of the best features in the world on the most used products have probably been an amalgamation of errors that have been made and fixes that have, had to happen. Features end up being, can be, the best features can be a fix of a problem. So I just can't think of any right now.
I'm a strong believer that if one doesn't make any mistakes or doesn't get things wrong, we're not bold enough.
Yeah.
Then we're just going for the safe bet. We need to get things wrong. We need to bet on something that we thought was a good idea, and then we go and test it and get data and validate with users and learn actually wasn't a good idea.
Yeah.
But we need to also have those moonshots and try new things, to not just optimize on the thing that we already have, but also see other new big opportunities. And for that, one needs that safe space, that psychological safety, knowing that it's okay if we get things wrong, because we'll learn from it and then fix forward.
Exactly.
In how do we get better with the next thing.
Yeah. But I think, going back to what we were saying earlier around the difference between a B2C and a B2B environment as well, I think this is really interesting, because certainly if you've never worked in a B2B environment, you might not even know this is a problem, but you just don't have the same level of data available to you. Because when you talk about your user, you could sit there as a team in a B2B product team and go, well, who's our user? Is it the person who's using it to do this particular outcome? Or is it as in, is using it day to day in order to be able to track, something that's happening? Or is it the user that's saying, I'm actually going to use that data that's been tracked to actually do a particular outcome? Or is it going to be the person who is having to use your system to be able to organize who in their entity is actually using the platform? So like the administrator or the person who's like sending and receiving invoices? Or is it the decision maker in the entity that's going to make a decision on actually using your platform? And in terms of that decision maker, is that the IT leader who's got the budget, or is it the procurement person who's running the procurement process? And then who's your influencers in all of that as well? And so, your customer entity mapping of all of those different people needs to think about all those different user types, the different persona types, in terms of how you're going to sell, upsell, and retain those customers in perpetuity. And so the data that you get, or the data that you would want, is understanding all of those different user types. But of course, that's not possible. It's very much a one-on-one. It's relationship building. You've got your commercial team that are out on the coalface, spending time, boots on the ground, going around and talking to all of those different customers and understanding their needs. So the data in that point comes from, if you get it, if you're lucky enough to be in a mature enough organization, is going to come from your CMS. And then you're relying on, the only data point there is going to be in Salesforce or something similar, which is entirely different to understanding customer trajectory and usage and workflow of your actual product. And even then, if you get mass adoption, you can get some customer insights in terms of usage, but it's going to be very different because you're not going to have thousands or millions of customers. You're going to have tens of customers or hundreds of customers, depending on, your B2B product and what it's like. And so you're not going to get statistically valid data from customer trajectory of usage or workflow. It's going to potentially, just be anecdotal. So you then need to really think about the blend of the data points you do have, either from your CMS or from your platform usage itself. And you've got the one-on-one conversations as well, really trying to understand what your customers are telling you. The voice of the customer needs to be in there as well. So it's a very different environment.
It's really at the other end of the spectrum, right? When we're in the B2C space, it's data-driven, purely based on product usage metrics. I'm exaggerating. And on the other spectrum, we don't have any automated data. There is the information that maybe our salespeople enter in our CMS and our sales tools. How good that happens, that can vary in quality because everyone enters it differently. But then also, they're not the only ones who interact with customers. So how do we actually capture that information across the organization to get a holistic picture around our B2B customers, and also not just one of those types, which may be users, but also the decision maker, procurement, the ones who have the budget, are the ones who may have to worry about maintenance of the product in the long run. So that's really interesting extremes. What works in the B2B space? What have you seen as strategies that make it successful to have a more data-informed approach where it's maybe even looser than in the B2C space?
I think it depends, Sabrina. Like, if you've got any data at all, then how you use it is going to be contextual anyway. But I would say in terms of collaboration and partnership between product and different parts of the organization, that's where you're going to set yourself up for success more often than not. And so I've had the challenge a few times in a B2B environment of changing the way the company works from being very much sales-led, commercially led, to being product-led. And by product-led, in those contexts, you have to be really careful that you don't mean led by the product team, you mean led by the product. And so it's not about going in and having like literally having a bun fight with the sales leader and going, no, you were in charge, now I'm in charge. That's not what it's about. And so how do you do that? How do you change the focus of the organization so that it's no longer, the roadmap isn't a scattergun approach of the most recent conversations that your commercial team have had with customers, and every feature that's on the roadmap has come from a commercial and customer conversation, and it's literally just chucking it over the fence to the product team to just trying to figure out how to deal with all of that. And that happens a lot. What's the route?
Then it's not the product. Then you're actually building custom software.
Yes. And then more often than not, the end result of that is you have this sort of Frankenstein sort of behemoth of a monolith of things where you've got, goodness knows how many different versions of your product. I've mentored people. Luckily, I haven't been in that situation myself, but I've mentored people who've been, gone in as a product leader, and they've been their role has been to try and unpick a product that has literally just become 6 or 7 or more things to their customer base, depending on the customer needs. And they are then responsible for figuring out, is there a route to replace all of this and re-platform so that we just have one product that's serving all of our customer needs? And that's an absolute nightmare for people to be able to then have to unpick that. And so as a product leader, if you know that if you don't fix that problem soon enough, that's what the end result could be, then that's a real incentive to make those changes quickly and make them well. And so the times that I've done it to success have been when I've just gone in and facilitated the product team sitting side by side with the commercial team. So I use like a product champions initiative where I'll, depending on the size of the commercial team, we'll have people sitting side by side with the product team on a regular basis. They're bringing the themes and the needs and the recent problems of the customers into the room. So you have a representative from every region or every different domain or whatever it might be, and they are there representing their teams, problems, not just their own. And you're then explaining to them the things that you're working on. What are the things that you've already built and the benefits of those? What are the things that you're planning on building next? And what are the things you're going to be building later? And so what that means is that the product becomes a part of the sales conversation, as opposed to the sales conversation just being, what do you want? And if the sales team are saying to a customer, what do you want? Then that's where your monolith, that's where your Frankenstein product just happens, because you're not actually saying to the customers, this is what we've built, which solves this particular problem, because we know that you have this need or this problem that needs to be solved for, and this is how our product solves that problem for you, and explains it. And this is how our roadmap and the plans that we have in the future will also solve problems for you, and using the things that are coming later as sales drivers for the future, sales enablers for the future. And that really makes a difference. And if you change that, if you're able to impact a change in how your commercial team are talking to your customers, or product are even sitting closer to the customer conversations themselves, you see that change happen. It's possible.
So this is a great principle to be successful in such a context, in the B2B context, where one maybe starts in a challenging situation, and how one can turn it around is sit together as a product leader with the commercial team and work closely on what are the key themes that make sense to be built into the product, and then using the product in that sales conversation to drive the conversation, rather than asking, what do you want? And shall we add something here or there?
Yeah, exactly.
Are there any other principles for the B2B context that have made you successful, or that you've seen in some of the people who you've mentored and coached that made them successful in the B2B context?
I think, like having the product team involved in the sales narrative, I think, is quite important too. So, I've been in lots of different environments where you've got product marketing exist as a function, but sometimes they don't exist. You've got sales enablement that exists as a function, but sometimes they don't exist. And I think what I'm trying to say is that as long as what your product does, what your platform is for, and is understood, is translated into the sales narrative, so that depending on who you're talking to, and this is the sort of the clincher here, and going back to those persona types we mentioned before, depending on whether it's the user and what type of user, depending on whether it's the decision maker, the buyer, the influencer, your sales narrative needs to really speak their language. And the thing that all of us have probably learned the hard way is that you can create this wonderful pitch, PowerPoint pitch, whatever it might be, in your ivory tower, and you take it to your customer and they're like, what are you talking about? You're using your own internal language, and you're not really thinking about how the customer talks about their own environment. And so as the quickest you can bring the customer voice and the customer language into your sales narrative, the better. You need to talk in the way they talk about their problems, about their environment, about their workflow. And so one thing I've learned the hard way is, fine, create your pitch, create your visuals, create the sort of the skeletal version of your pitch, take it to a customer as soon as you can, and get them to tell you what they see. What do you see? How is this going to fit with you? How would you describe this thing? What's the words you would use to describe it? And the best successes I've seen when you're bringing that tone of voice and the language into your pitch that the customer is using. How would they describe your platform? What does it mean to them? Make that your tagline if it works, because the way you talk about it isn't necessarily going to resonate with the people that you're selling to. And that will change again, depending on whether you're talking to the head of IT who's got the budget, or the head of procurement who doesn't care about the actual platform, but does care about the outcome. The things they need to tick through their procurement process are, does the return on investment outweigh the cost and the pain to get this thing integrated into our entity? And if it doesn't, why would we take the time? Because it's mostly that integration is the bit that's going to take the time, like embedding your software into their workflows and things like that.
And what do these things mean if we think back to the data-informed decision-making? How do those principles help with achieving that in the B2B context?
Yeah, I mean, it's really tricky because the data points there are going to be either from your CMS or from your market research. It might be anecdotal, so it might not necessarily be statistically valid data. It's not going to be at the same volume. And so your data points there are going to be, you're going to have to be a bit more creative in terms of where you get them, how you use them, and how you enable them to drive decisions, I would say.
Nice. And I'd love to flip the question around, what principles made you successful in the B2C space, where we're again at the really other extreme spectrum, where decisions are data driven rather than data informed.
Yeah.
What principles help you to be more data informed and maybe also create that space for your team, your colleagues to be bold and be a data informed product leader?
I think it's probably the same answer for both environments, both B2B and B2C, to be honest with you. I'm a big believer in partnerships and collaboration. And so if you said to me, like, what's the simplest way to describe what product is about as a discipline, whether that's product management or product leadership, because ultimately those are two different disciplines, really. It's about relationship building. You need to find the people within your organization that you need to work collaboratively with and partner with, and you need to build up a relationship with them, and you need to build up trust. And the quickest you can do that, the more effectively you can do that, the more you're going to be able to figure out what the problem is and how to fix it. You can't do that just with product and technology, or just with product and data, or product and marketing, or product and commercial. You have to have those blends of context and agendas, everybody in the room together, getting them all focused on the same thing. And I think, in startup land, it's a lot easier because you can go, right, what's our mission? What is it that we're trying to achieve? What's our vision? What's our North Star? And you can have an all hands and everyone can sit there together and, you can have that conversation. But I think in a big corporate, sometimes it's harder because it's not always as defined. It can be sometimes more broad, and you get confused with, one CEO to the next. They come in and they make these big bold statements, and people get lost and they don't even know what the vision is anymore. And maybe the vision is just ROI and they're not quite sure. Just make money, any money, as long as we're bringing money in. I think, and sometimes people get lost a little bit. Yeah. But I think in terms of your role as a product person or a product leader in that environment is, what can you do to bring people together to understand the problem space better and to create a solution together?
So this is a very nice principle that has made you successful. Now, our listeners may wonder, I've been in a data-driven environment where decisions are very much driven by the quantitative data. How can they take those first bold steps to go beyond that and become more data informed and look at more sources that go beyond the product usage data?
I think if you've been more data led rather than data informed, is if we're going to use those two terms, then there is always going to be a way that you can add some meat to the bones of the data story. You can either go and talk to your customer research team, your customer marketing team. You could go and talk to your customer. More often than not, there are going to be reams and reams of customer interviews, content that's been created by your research team. You might have had an agency come in and do something that you can then go back and look over. And I certainly have landed in a number of entities where there are just reams and reams of content over the last couple of years that are still going to be relevant to you, and you don't necessarily need to commission another project in order to find out what your customer needs and pain points and emotions are. And I would say just immerse yourself as much as possible in the voice of the customer and the customer need, like literally going back to those first principles. And once you start to bring that to life and you're understanding the persona of a customer, then you can start to understand a bit more about what some of those data points might mean. And one of the things I didn't say earlier, but going back to when sort of quant and qual were the order of the day. When I was at Sky years and years ago, and you're thinking you've got 10 million odd customer homes and the number of people in those homes, and you're trying to understand who your customers are, we were lucky enough to be able to commission a piece of sort of statistic finding research that then brought the data in, and then from that data we were able to create some personas. And I remember sitting down in a hotel in Richmond back in the early noughties, and we created about 7 or 8 different personas based on data that we were able to get, because you were able to get some data from doing those types of surveys and things like that back in the day. And that was amazing. You're basically going like, Trevor, is in his 40s. He reads, The Sun and drives a Mondeo. Like, we literally had this level of sort of demographic data that we could get. Now, I don't know necessarily if Trevor's going to use the Sky box any differently to Sally, who read the Telegraph and drove a BMW, but it started to bring our customers to life a little bit more in terms of their needs, when it's impossible to bring the customer to life when you've got 10 million customer homes, and most of those homes are made up of very different human types and human groups,
Yeah.
which is very difficult. So we used the data to be able to create a handful of personas that made it a little bit easier for us to start to bring to life the customer need and the emotions.
And do you maybe have a pro tip? So someone who is already data informed and goes for breadth of different data sources to inform product decisions. What would be a pro tip for such a person?
Don't keep it to yourself. I think that's the one thing I would finish on. Figure out the best way that you could, if you're data informed already, how can your entire organization, or at least at the very least the entire product organization, be also data informed? There is no benefit to you on your own or even your product team being data informed if the entire organization aren't. If if you're sitting down there doing your quarterly planning with the rest of the the tech entity, like product and tech together, if your whole product and tech division isn't data informed, it's going to be a lot harder for you to make those prioritization calls, especially if you've got some tech debt that's also vying for a place on the platform. You need to have the
Wonderful.
data on all of those. And I talk about tech debt, but the data behind the impact of that tech debt as well. You need the data and the information around what that means to your customers, as well as the features.
That's a really great tip. Thank you so much, Bex. I have one final question before we go. So this podcast is called Creating Better Products.
Mm.
Why would you say is it so important that product leaders are data informed rather than data led? And how does that, or does it, lead to creating better products?
I think if you only have a thin sliced view and your narrative as a product leader is a thin sliced view, you're just going to miss out on some of the depths of things that you can offer to your customers and to the platform itself. And I think if you're a product lead, and especially that conversation that you're having outwards and upwards, that narrative is going to be better if it's got a bit more depth to it.
Okay, Bex, final question. What is something that you're currently reading that energizes you or inspires you?
I think one of the challenges I've had throughout my career is I personally haven't had a female leader that I could look to and be inspired by. And so I've looked outside of my organisation in a number of different ways in order to understand what female leadership in tech could look like. I've been inspired by people. So Christine Lagarde, who's the president of the European Central Bank of Europe, is a phenomenal female leader, and she talks about you can lead from love, and if you've got confidence, you can give confidence to others. And she's just in a very male environment, is not afraid to lean into the female aspects of her character, her own personality. So that's sort of a top tip. Number one is like find people like that you can look to and be inspired by. I've been reading for a long time, and I dip in and out of it every now and then, an incredible book. I can't remember the authors right now, but it's called How Females Rise. And one of the things that it's really inspired me about is that it talks, my summarization of that is we are aware as women, especially in tech, some male-dominated environments, that there are remnants of the glass ceiling that are still preventing us from being able to achieve some successes. There's going to be gender bias, whether it's conscious or unconscious, that are going to get in the way sometimes. But sometimes it's the sticky frickin' floor. And this is something that this book has brought to my attention. It's our own inaction, our own fears, our own lack of confidence. And those can come from all manner of things, which leads me to my third recommendation is find your people. Find a community or find a group or lean into people outside. Sometimes it could be inside, but sometimes outside of your own organization. And that was why I created the Female Product Lead, because I didn't see a community that was going to give me what I needed. So I created one, which is all about empowering female product leaders of today and tomorrow. We have a vision of equity in product leadership, and we're looking at how we can dismantle gender bias and give female leaders the confidence they need. And I should say it's not just females, it's any underrepresented or marginalized people in leadership or aspiring to be in leadership in tech. Find your people, get that confidence, look to be able to have those conversations, to be able to analyze some of the challenges that you have or the hurdles that get in the way, and be able to go through those with somebody else. And it could also just be a coach or a mentor as well. Just as long as you're having those conversations, I think you're going to get the empowerment and the confidence that you need and the tips that you need from people who've maybe been through it before themselves, or either peer advice or lived experiences that can be shared, in order for you to know ultimately that you're not alone. And that's the biggest thing, I think, is that knowing you're not alone, because that then helps knowing that you can lean on people, get confidence and get advice from other people.
Thank you for this really, really inspiring recommendations. Bex, where can people find you in case they say, I really want to continue the conversation with you?
Just type in Beks Yelland into LinkedIn and connect.
Wonderful. Then, Bex, thank you so much for sharing your perspective today, and also your inspiration that keeps you going. And yeah, thank you so much.
No problem at all, Sabrina. It's been an absolute pleasure.
And now a question to our listeners. Actually, a question to you. What is your experience with being data-led versus data-informed? How are you able to navigate that space and go beyond the hard data that's tracked in your product and trust your intuition? Get other data to get a fuller picture of the experience that your product is creating. What were your successes and setbacks? I would really love to hear about your experience. So please reach out to me directly or leave your feedback in the comments. And if you enjoyed this episode as much as I did, please share it with your network and give us a like and subscribe in your favorite streaming platform. And by doing that, you elevate the voice of our amazing guests. And today, this was Bex. Thank you, and see you next time.